Okay. Okay, and let's go. So, welcome to another UX Greece meetup, kicking off our second season today. I'm Ioannis Feneris, and next to me are the meetup co-organizers, Dimitris Stathis and Dimitris Navis. And if this is your first time here, let me say that the UX Greece is a community of UX people where once every quarter, almost a quarter, we welcome pioneers in the fields of UX and product and business. And we have the opportunity to discuss great topics with them. To be a member, just follow the LinkedIn group and get notified for its next event. It's so simple to do. I'm going to give the link in the chat in a minute. A big thank you to our sponsors that support our events, Zansi Labs, the UX Prodigy, and the From Scratch Design Studio. And also thanks for your support and for offering great gifts. And we know that there is no better gift than a book. So here's how you can get our today's books. Just write a message on LinkedIn. You can say hi, you can introduce yourself, say thanks to David, to our speakers, share a moment from this event with your network, and do this using the hashtags UX and UX Greece from now and for the next 5 hours until the end of the day here in Greece. We are going to gather the posts, randomly pick the winners, and contact the lucky ones on LinkedIn. The usual reminder to my younger self and to everyone, don't keep the questions for yourselves. Ask them in the chat, or you can ask David directly in the Q&A session after the presentation. This is why we are here today. And Dimitris, how about a proper introduction for David? The stage is yours.
Yes, thank you. So we're really lucky to have David here with us. David has been a pioneer in testing business ideas. He helps companies, startups, how to do this. He practically wrote the book on how to test business ideas with Alex Osterwalder. He has also worked with Eric Ries in GE Fastworks, coached emerging product teams at Adobe, and even helped Toyota apply lean startup practices. Before his transition to consulting, David has spent for over 10 years of his careers in technology startups. He's also staying connected to the startup scene through his work in several Silicon Valley accelerators and startups around the world in general. Last but not least, David is the pound for pound #1 and on spot on business startup memes on the internet. David, thank you so much for being here with us.
Wow, that's a lot to live up to with that title. I will try to keep it going. Yeah, if the inside joke there is if you follow me on LinkedIn, you're going to see a lot of memes. But you know, that's how I think we could all laugh a bit, especially nowadays. All right, so yeah, I'm David. I'm out here in Northern California, and what I'm going to be doing today is sharing a little bit behind the scenes of how I work with teams. And so you're going to get a little sampling of that, of how I work with teams. We will do a little exercise as well. I'm not going to use slides today. I'm going to use Mural. So you'll all be able to jump in and help out, and we'll work on an exercise together, and then we'll have some Q&A. So just save your questions. We'll try to get through them all as many as we can anyway before we wrap up. So yeah, a lot of this is going to be based on my book I wrote with Alex Osterwalder. So I'm out here, Northern California, outside the Bay Area, outside Silicon Valley, and Alex is based in Lausanne, Switzerland. And so, you know, in writing the book, I would fly out there and he would fly back, but most of it was written distributedly. I was writing out in like coffee shops out here, and then flying to Toronto and working with a designer, working with Alan and Trish and Chris and team. And so, you know, we've learned a lot even since the book has been out. You know, the book is kind of based off of, I don't know, 10 years or so, my experience doing this stuff, but then I've learned even since the book. So I'll try to give you my latest view on things. So yeah, it's going to be a lot about the book. Today, you know, the learning objective here is kind of going beyond UX a bit, or at least giving you facilitative superpowers on how to interact with technology and business and how to frame things. You know, I think as UXers, and I have a design degree myself, a lot of people don't even know that anymore. That's how I got my career started, was a designer. You know, you're stuck in between, like needing to facilitate whether you want to or not. And so being able to frame things a certain way, being able to look at risk, being able to help people frame things up and test, I think it's really going to be beneficial for you all. And some of that's already permeated the UX community. but I would say there's still a lot of work to be done. And so hopefully today it gives you some, different ideas that you can use or more options as far as how you frame things and how you facilitate, how you look at risk with teams you're working with. I do have a code of conduct for everything I do, which is pretty much the Bill and Ted code of conduct, which is be excellent to one another. So, when we are sharing out and everything, just be respectful in tone and in content. I'm not too worried about this group, but I just want to call it out. All right. So let's start with a diagram you all probably know really well, which is this idea of how we frame risk and desirability, viability, feasibility. If you Google this diagram online, if you just search for desirable, viable, feasible, you're going to see stuff from me. You're going to see stuff from Marty Kagan. You're going to see IDEO, Stanford D School, Larry Keeley, Doblin Group, Institute of Chicago, Mind the Product probably. You're going to see a lot of things that are related to this. It's hard to really find the single source of truth. I've been able to trace it far back as Larry Keeley and Institute of Design, but then even there it gets a little messy. But basically, I like it because it holds up no matter what industry I'm working in. And I don't just work in software. I work in chemical companies, I work in car companies, paint companies, toothpaste companies, a lot of different kinds of companies. And what the common theme I see is this idea of, these three themes of risk, right? So desirability, asking sort of this do they question, right? Do we understand the jobs to be done? Do we understand the value proposition, the pains they have, the gains they're looking for? Do they understand our value proposition? Sometimes they don't. So being able to frame that up and really understand the risk there, because quite honestly, if you don't spend time there, you've probably experienced this, you can make something really polished that essentially no one cares about. When you look at viability, I ask, should we? Obviously you should have a moral compass in business and make ethical business decisions. In addition to that, it has to be financially viable. It has to sustain in some way. Even the greatest ideas, right? For them to live on, it has to be sustainable in some fashion. And so quite often we're looking at the impact we have, the business, the revenue, right? Even if you're a nonprofit, you're looking at, can we raise money to show the impact we have again and again? And so viability is really interesting as well. And then feasibility is more backstage. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of companies still spend way too much time, which is more of the can we question. And the can we question is technical feasibility, but it's also other things, right? It's how you're organized as a company. Like sometimes it's technically feasible, but you can never prioritize the work properly or organize around the work properly. Sometimes it's regulatory, governance, compliance ends up shutting you down. Sometimes it's governments, right? So just because it technically works, you may also run into regulatory risks, other things. And so maybe a little different than IDEO, I tend to expand beyond just technical feasibility, because you often see this framed as just tech and technology. But I like thinking about it a little more than that. Are you organized as a company to do this? Prioritize it. Are you going to run into any regulatory or governance or compliance problems? So, I work with companies that, they bring me in and they're focused here. They're focused on desirability. So do people want it? And viability, but then they neglect the feasibility part. And can they execute? And you still fail in a big way, not a small way when you do that. You think of Kickstarters, Indiegogos, crowdfunding campaigns that looked amazing. They had an amazing video. You threw money at it. You said, like, I want it now. And then the updates get, fewer and far further between. The updates are kind of like, oh, I'm still working on your t-shirts. And it's like, I don't care about the t-shirt. I want the product. And then it was like, oh, I had a cold last month, so not a lot of progress. And then before you know it, the whole thing shuts down. It's usually because there was some inherent feasibility risk that they didn't understand. And so a thing I point out to crowdfunding, people that want to do crowdfunding, is that it doesn't address all three themes of risk. It addresses desirability risk and a little bit of viability risk, but it doesn't address, feasibility risk at all. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you're working through this process. Another angle that I see is that I work with companies that they talk to the customers. So they try to figure out the desirability, understand that. They're able to deliver, so the feasibility they're able to handle, but they completely neglect the pricing, the viability side. And when that happens, well, you end up with products people love that end up going away because they couldn't keep it going. it wasn't financially viable. I used when I keynoted Mind the Product in San Francisco, I used the example of Clearly Canadian, which was like this 90s clear carbonated drink. It was kind of before Crystal Pepsi or a lot of the clear carbonated craze, but they made it in such a way, it was this really expensive teardrop shaped bottle. It was expensive to produce and distribute, and it cost a lot more than other alternatives. And eventually, it's one of the reasons they couldn't keep the business going. They couldn't keep the product going. Recently, a venture capitalist bought the IP and kind of relaunched it. Ironically enough, using Indiegogo. But it's a good example of something we loved, but then it just financially wasn't viable and didn't last because of that. And then finally, what I still see far too often, and even out here in Silicon Valley, is this combo, where it can be built. You can build almost anything nowadays, and it looks like it's viable, right? Like keep your costs low and charge a certain price point, but then nobody cares. Like it doesn't solve a job to be done. It doesn't create a gain for the customer. It doesn't alleviate a pain they're experiencing. And so you still end up with a lot of these technology pushes coming out of the Valley and other places too. I work with companies all around the world now, and they come out with these technologies that just are searching for a problem to solve. And you either find one before you run out of money or you don't. And I think it's a really difficult place to be in, especially if you have cool tech. And so what I'm trying to do now with technology companies is like, let's sooner rather than later start testing the value prop, the customer segment, and all that. So ideally, right, you sort of want to look at these from 3 different angles and then eventually get to a point where you can address all 3 versions of risk. It doesn't mean you have to do them all at the same time, but it is important. And as UXers, right, you play a lot in this world and maybe a little bit in this world, and then maybe not so much at all over here, right? And so you need to be able to facilitate conversations so that we're not ignoring these other parts. So when you think of balanced teams, you think of it's called the triad, like Teresa Torres frames it that way, and Jeff Patton. You need cross-functional leadership at a lot of this level. Otherwise, if you just focus on one kind of risk, you might fail in a big way rather than a small way, just because we're not addressing all 3. So what we've been doing is, and I think my book's the first time we did this in print, but basically for a while, Alex and Eve and others have been like layering this thinking over the business model canvas. And the canvas has been around for a long time, and there are many, many different types of canvases now. I fully admit that. This is sort of the one that started it all, so to speak. And when we laid the thinking over it, it kind of helped give it a bit of focus. So we start looking at, all right, from our value prop and a customer segment, like that's a lot of desirability risk in your canvas. And so a lot of your desirability risk is up here. A lot of viability risk is sort of down here in your cost and revenue. Can you do it at low enough cost? Can you do it at a high enough price point? And then feasibility, it's a lot of can you execute? A lot of risk there. Feasibility risk is your ability to do the activities, resources, and sign partners. And so when you think about the flow of a canvas, right, I tend to spend a lot of my time up here. When I'm helping teams create their strategies, I spend a lot of time like, who are you targeting for a customer? What's your value prop to them? How do you reach them? What's the nature of relationship? A lot of that's desirability risk, upfront desirability risk. And so there's work to be done without building anything. You can start de-risking a bit of that through research, through running experiments, a lot of where your world is, and you can do it without building. That's the dirty secret, right? Everyone wants to build right away, but you can do a lot without building to pay down the risk. And I think we tend to jump to build too soon. And then I tend to jump down here as to, okay, how do you make money directly or indirectly? And then backstage, I help teams work through, okay, what are the activities? So think verbs, the key verbs you need to do. What are the resources? So think nouns, physical, digital, could be IP, could be patents, could be the team, could be, an app or a platform. What's that cost? And then who do you partner with? So it's not a left to right tool. And I think people still make that mistake where they just want to do left to right. Maybe it's a Western thing. We always want to go left to right because we read left to right. But I often talk about partners last. And when I'm talking about partners, it's like, do they bring an activity that we can't do or don't want to do? Do they bring a resource that either we don't have or can't create? Or maybe they're even a channel partner where they help us create a channel to go to our customer. And so that's why, I don't really lead with key partners usually. And then if you look at backstage from there, right, you can look at your activities and resources and say, well, this is what this costs. I can look at what do we need to do? What do we need to have? Here's what it costs. And then if you go to the front stage, you can say, well, this is how we deliver our value to customers. Here's the bi-directional relationship of our, relationship with the customer. Here's how we get money from them directly or indirectly. And then, oh, by the way, right, like we should have more profit than, we should be able to charge enough where it's more than our cost eventually. And so I think this kind of nuance is missed a lot with the Canvas. We've learned a lot by putting it into practice over the years. And I've seen thousands of these, with teams. And it's usually just a checklist. They just go check, yep, got a value prop. I'll check all the boxes so I can go build what I want to build. And where I think it's instead going to be really valuable to you is just being able to look at the relationships and look at where your risk is. And so what we've been doing is, I say, oh my God, it's connected. Yeah. If you go like really early days, I spent a week with Alex in Switzerland, even before we started writing the book together. And I spent a week with him and Lasan, him and Eve and the team. And I was kind of like, how did you come up with the idea of this canvas? And really, if you look at the early white papers, like from Henry Chesbrough and other people, it looked like a systems thinking diagram. And I think, some of that maybe have been lost when it was converted into a canvas. I'm a geek. I still like to think system thinking is going to become popular. I do think it's the next big leap that we need to make because we have all these like separate frameworks, but we don't know how they all connect together yet really well. And so I'm just really excited by that. So I still think systems thinking is going to come back. But if you look at early versions of the canvas, it looked like a systems thinking diagram. There weren't boxes like this. Just like fun fact there. So basically, when you look at this canvas, it's a series of just guesses early on. And I really try to help teams understand that. It doesn't mean you get it right early on. It's just a series of guesses. And so what we try to do is we try to write those down as assumptions. And so I like this we believe format. I used to work with Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden. I just had the pleasure of working with a lot of smart people over the years. And I worked with them back at Neo, but also know them even before Neo. And they wrote Lean UX, which was a huge book. It landed really well with the UX community too, about how to test your way through stuff. And I really liked how they were framing things in there, right? The we believe statement. So I tend to do that, but I use design thinking themes. So I use, orange, I like colors. So I use orange for desirability, and I use green for viability. So those bottom two boxes, and I use blue for feasibility. And you can use whatever colors you want, but I like the colors because it does separate them a bit, even though they're related. And so what happens is we start writing with the team, right? So you think about this team. Sorry, let me move over here a bit and I'll scroll out a bit. So if you think about this team of who makes up this sort of triad, right? This balanced team, UX, research, you think of product, maybe finance, tech, legal, right? Depending on how you're made up. You need those folks to get together and address the assumptions in the model, right? So when you're answering these, if you have the right people in the room, you can go through that exercise. I've made the mistake in my past. I had a group of designers, UX designers. I won't name the company. It was a really, really well-known company. And they were having their offsite. And they're like, hey, let's go through this. Come in and teach us. And I went through all this and everything. And I felt like without having other representation, we came out with a view of risk, but it was very skewed towards UX because we didn't have other representation in the room. And so we don't know where that risk was in relation to the other risks. And so I really do, when I can, I try to configure these teams. And especially if design is left out, sometimes I'll come into a program at a company and there's literally no designers around. And I call it out as a red flag right away. I'm like, look, we need designers on this team. Like, that's sorry. Like we're going to do discovery work. We need design help. And so just be mindful that if you don't have representation, when you do this, you're going to have kind of a skewed version of risk. So something to think about. So what we do is we write these down, and then we have a little 2x2 I help create called assumptions mapping, right? And so, I credit Jeff and Josh for the early version of this, but I've changed it quite a bit over the years. Google uses this now. So Google reached out to me. It's in their design sprint kit program. I gave a talk with Google before the pandemic about this with their head of their program. It's used by governments. A lot of different places use this now. It's pretty much out there. There are many different versions of it. So if you use different, labels, whatever, that's fine. I'm not too picky about the labels. These are the ones I use. And so what we do is we say, okay, as a team, we wrote this stuff down. How important is this to the success of this opportunity? And then how much evidence do we have to support it? And usually the easier question to answer here is how important it is. We could always say, oh, that's like, if that's wrong, it's okay. We'll get by. Or, oh my gosh, if this is wrong, we're doomed. That's how the conversations usually go. But the evidence side, this is where people get tripped up, because you really need to use this to calibrate the confidence of your team. And so, for example, if you only said you did a couple interviews and you ran a survey, I think the tendency for teams I work with is to say, okay, yep, that's validated. Let's move on to the next one. I'm like, whoa, wait. All we did was ask people what they might do and survey them. Like, that is very light evidence. That is not something I would place a very big bet on, because the gap between what people say they'll do and what they do is huge. And so we need to do other things over time to increase that evidence, to feel more confident about making this decision. And so I like, oh no, this goes over here. Like, this is almost closer to the no evidence side of things. And so what we do is we have that conversation. And then when we pull up the next one, we say, okay, is this more or less important than that one? And then we go, oh, that's a little less important. Okay, do we have more or less evidence? Oh, we actually have more evidence on this one. Okay. And so what happens is you end up with this really interesting map, right? You're able to kind of, like, as a team, and it's going to be wrong, but it's how degrees of wrong here. But, it's a good starting conversation of where should we begin our experimentation, right? Based on what we know now. And what tends to happen, like Eric would say, Eric Ries would say, this is like a leap of faith assumption, right? Or a riskiest assumption. Sometimes you all frame it that way. But basically, when you think about it, that is this top right. Okay, here's my drawing here. It's your top right. It's the most important stuff where you have the least amount of evidence. So if you're going to experiment there. Right. And that's what we did in the book. And it's based off all my coaching, right? I have, we can't go through all the 44 experiments today, but, there's 44 of them in the book. And what I tried to do is pretty ambitious, I have to say. And there's some still conceptual problems with it. I will admit that. But what it did was give people a way to choose. So there's no more like lists of stuff. I feel like you all don't lack lists of stuff. You can go to blog posts. You can go to Reddit. You can go to growth hacker forums. Like there's plenty of lists of stuff. I think where people struggle is how to choose based on where they are. And so that's what we try to address. So with discovery, right? There's a group of discovery experiments, and we kind of built this off of, like Steve Blank stuff. He wrote 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and backstory there is Eric Ries was in Steve's class, and that's how Eric got the idea for a lean startup book. But basically, if you're just starting out, from an evidence point of view, we're trying to go from none to some, all right? And so we want to do like kind of open-ended directional experiments. Like we want to know preference and prioritization. We want to know, do they understand the jobs pain? We understand the jobs pains and gains. We want to know, is anybody actively seeking a solution to this problem? So a lot of these are kind of categories as research. I tend to frame those experiments a bit because I want to tie them back to like a hypothesis that we're trying to test. And so what I did is I went through everything I've done with teams over the last 10 years. And like I said, it's pretty ambitious. And I said, okay, what theme does this apply to? Like, does it desirable, viable, or feasible, or many? How much does it cost? How long does it take to do? Like, what kind of evidence does it throw off? And so again, conceptually, it was pretty ambitious. I would say there's some challenges with it. There's probably some things in there I would tweak now, but it works pretty well. Like it fills a gap that we didn't have in the industry. I felt like there was a need there. With validation, it's similar, although these are usually you're further down the road. And so there's a real value exchange. So here, from an evidence point of view, you're trying to go from some evidence to strong evidence. And here you're trying to, test, let's say, a minimum viable product, right? Or something where there's a real value exchange. You're not just extracting value from people. You're trying to really, it's not just, do you understand my value prop? It's, oh, I'll manually deliver this value to you and get feedback from you on how it solved your problem, right? So there's a real value exchange. And so with that, I tried to write a book. I really tried. I tried to write a book without saying minimum viable product, and I was almost successful. Where I wasn't was here. And why I wasn't successful was because I wanted to go into types. So I don't want to have this like endless debate about MVPs. I want to talk about, hey, like what kind of types do I really see? Well, what do I see of teams are things like a concierge, where you manually deliver the value without building anything. It's kind of like a white glove service, right? Another one I see is Wizard of Oz. It's kind of like Concierge, except there's like a digital curtain there where, you know, you're delivering value, but it's not obvious a person's involved. So a lot of the AI startups I work with, AI is notorious for this. You know, it's a lot of spreadsheets behind the scenes till they get enough to make the AI, right? There's still value. They're still delivering value that you can pay for, the customers pay for, but it's not much. Like there's not much AI there yet. Eventually they get there. With other MVPs, there's a single feature, which I always point to Amazon Dash buttons. You know, Amazon was basically testing away from screen experience. Like, would people buy anything away from their laptop or their phone or their tablet? And they didn't know. And so the Dash buttons were a way to test that. And that was testing their Alexa strategy, right? So they would have a physical button, let's say on your washing machine, that ordered detergent. And when you ran out of detergent next to that machine, you would press the button and it would order it for you. Those are no longer in existence. They were just testing. Well, some people hack them still, but they don't support them officially anymore. They had those because they were trying to figure out, would anyone purchase anything? Now, like, everything talks to everything else. So your washing machine talks to the internet and your Alexa and just orders stuff for you. But back then that was like a big leap in their strategy. They weren't sure about behavior change with people, whether they would do that. And so I feel like that's a great single feature. Another one, you could say Foursquare, early days Foursquare, you would just check in, you know, that would be pretty much what you did. And then Mashup is another one I see. I see this a lot in the software community, where you're mashing up, let's say Airtable and like a landing page and a Google form and something else. And, you know, it ends up being an early stage product. I would say, you know, some of the like no code movement, there's a lot of mashup stuff now. I had folks from Zapier in my masterclass, and they actually, it's kind of meta. They actually use the book to test things for Zapier where people use them for no code. It's kind of cool. But they, you know, they test a calendar thing in calendar on browser thing. It was a connection and they were testing it, but it was no code, right? It was like you use your Zaps to kind of connect things and all that. With hardware, not so much. I would say maybe early days Tesla, right? I met some of the co-founders of Tesla. They came to our meetup. And they talked about how they mashed up a Lotus Elise body with some electronic parts. I do see it sometimes in hardware, but I would say most of the time I see it in software. So overall, right, for those of you who don't have the book, you know, there's a really great selection there of things to choose. So it's over 200, it's almost 200 pages of the book, really, of just, you know, how to do this. And again, I don't have a lot of the software tools in the book. Insider note here, like, if you want to date your book, put a bunch of stuff in there that'll be obsolete in a couple of years. So I intentionally did not put all that in the book. I have some of that stuff. If you're curious, I could always throw it on the board here for you, like some of the software tools I use for all this stuff. But just to go into the taxonomy a bit before we do our little exercise. So, you know, basically, again, pretty ambitious of me, but I tried to break it down into, you know, how would people choose? Like, how do I help teams choose? And I have to say, one of the great things I had from my editor was, you know, write the book like you're coaching teams. And that's all I do. That's all I do is coach teams. So that was a really good statement. That was really good feedback for me, because I thought, yeah, I can imagine what I would tell a team in this situation, because I've seen this situation a lot. And so what I ended up doing was sort of like, well, one, we have these amazing illustrations. So Owen Pomry out of the UK, he's a professional illustrator. We had him hand draw each one of these. It was amazing. So props to him. He has a website. It's like owenpomry.com, I think. It's POMREY. We tried to make it accessible. So all these have like friendly illustrations. We also did some subcategorization. So each one, like in Discovery, we'll say, oh, this is like, you know, something else. We also have the title, right? And then we have this little description of what it does. And then probably what's most useful for folks is down here. We say, how much does this cost? What's the evidence strength? What's the setup time, the runtime? What kind of capabilities do you need? And then what themes does it test? Desirability, feasibility, viability. And so with all that information, right, it should help you make an informed decision about what you could potentially do. Like, how do you find your next best test as a team, right? And so with Concierge, right, you could see backstage, oh, well, I'm testing a little bit of feasibility back here because we're hand delivering, like we're hand creating the thing. We're testing desirability here because we're interacting with the customer. And we also test viability a bit, right? My V there, because they're paying for it. And then we can also test viability back here a bit too. because we're seeing what it costs to create this, right? And so you can, I tried to organize the book just on those themes, and it didn't work because some of these test more than one theme. And so it was really tough for me to organize the book in a way where it was like, oh, let's just, do desirable experiments, viable experiments, feasible experiments. In reality, and I've been doing this a while, I was like, oh, that's not going to work. Like, I don't even know if I can write this book. And I had like an existential crisis. And eventually, I remember like Alex and I were overlooking Lake Geneva. We were at a cabin, which is the worst place to write a book. And I was like, oh my gosh, Alex, I think I have to just scrap the book because I don't think I can organize this stuff. And finally, we realized like, oh, let's do a taxonomy where you can see the different themes applied and it doesn't have to be organized by the themes. So what I included in here is a cheat sheet to the book. All right. So Tendai Vicky, who's associate partner at Strategyzer, he's an amazing guy. He worked on these early on when we wrote the book. And I don't really mass distribute them very often. Like it doesn't go as deep as the book, but they're in here in the board for you. They're like little PDFs. And so, for example, if you're like, I don't know what a feature stub is, right? Well, you can see this is like, oh, it's just a small test of an upcoming feature. So basically, it's a stub of a feature. So for example, Google does this all the time where you like click on something. It's like, we're not finished yet. How likely would you be? Blah, 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 right? Doesn't cost very much. The evidence strength is actually pretty good because it's in-app experience in the real world, right? You're usually not testing on everybody. It's usually a segment. And you usually don't test it on mission critical stuff, and you don't test it for very long. So at most, maybe 3 days. At minimum, like it might just run for a few hours. But it's one way to break that circle of, I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's a great idea. Well, let's just go test. Like, stop arguing about it. But basically, these are PDFs. So for example, if I just double click that guy, it actually creates like the PDF. So my editor hasn't killed me yet for putting these on. So I'm going to keep running with it. Just I ask, don't like widely distribute them on the internet yet. But anyway, so what I did is I put these in here for you. So what I want to do is, let me put a link in chat here. So you don't have to create an account. This is just free. So you'll just come in as anonymous, like enter as visitor, you're coming as anonymous, whatever, snail or bug at the bottom. So, oh, and full disclosure, I do advise this company. I do advise Mural because I was an early adopter, but you do not have to create anything. There's no insider trading here. You don't have to pay for anything. It's just free. So what I'm going to do, so check out the experiments there. And what I want to do is I just want to go through a fun example with you all. And then maybe you can create some if you feel like you're up for it. So, like I said, this is all I do. Like, it's pretty fun. I have a really pretty amazing life when I think about it. I just get to like go around to companies and have them test new things that they want to work on. And so this is a real one. So this one it was a men's dating advice chatbot. All right. So this one is a team out of New York, small team. I still talk with some of them. Actually, the one of the women on the team that was leading it, she started a new company similar to this, but for it's not dating advice. It's giving new parents advice for things they should buy for their kids, like for development milestones. It's pretty awesome. She's actually looking for funding right now. So you could do a lot of things if you're going to build this. Like if I went to a big company, they would probably throw a team of 20 engineers on this, a data scientist, a designer, product manager, maybe a product owner, maybe a project manager, scrum master. Like you would have a team of 30 trying to create a chatbot, right? This team started off with customer interviews. They were like, you know what? We don't know what like with dating advice, we don't know what kind of gaps there are. So let's talk to men and see, where they get their dating advice. After that, they did some search trend analysis. So basically, they went online and they looked for what they heard in the interviews. So this was really important, right? What they were hearing in the interviews, because they can run a bunch of those, right? They did like 15 to 20 interviews. But statistically, you can back your way into Google Trends and Answer the Public and Keyword Planner and all that stuff and see, are people actually like typing this stuff into Google, right? And so you can get to that data. You can say, oh, there's like 10,000 searches for this in the last 3 months in New York or whatever. So they did search analysis. Then after what they learned from that, they started doing some paper prototyping. So they started sketching out what it could do and testing with customers, like what it could answer and how the flow could work. They made an explainer video, right, of how it would work. Then after that, they ended up doing a landing page. And on the landing page, they ended up promoting it through discussion forums. So places like Hacker News was one of the things they were using to drive traffic to it. Because that's usually the question. It's like, I have a page, but how do I get people to it? And Hacker News was like their typical, not to sound stereotype, not to stereotype, but they were like their typical, early adopter. And then they did a Wizard of Oz. So basically, they had a team of women that would answer the texts, but they would answer it as if they were a bot. So people thought they were talking to a bot, but they were actually talking to 3 different women who were answering in the same tone, like cadence, frequency, all that. They modeled it off of some famous actress. I don't remember who it was. But basically, what I liked about them is they took this testing approach, right? They said, we're going to do interviews, and we're going to use that to inform search trend to see if anyone else is searching for this. For then, after we learn out of that, we're going to sketch it out what it could look on paper, literally no colors, just sketching. We'll use that to help, test and inform our explainer video. From that, we'll put that, on a page. We'll drive traffic to it from the forums. And then when people sign up, we'll Wizard of Oz it, we'll basically just manually give them dating advice. Okay, so I love that approach, but there were a couple things that went horribly wrong, which happens when you do this stuff. First off, they thought a couple people would sign up. They were worried like nobody would sign up. That's why they took this approach. They had 1,000+ signups in the first couple hours. Okay. So what happened was, I don't know how it got out. I don't remember exactly, but we had, we have 3 women over here trying to keep up with the demand of 1,000 signups, and it overwhelmed them. And so you had people on Hacker News posting like, "Oh, I'm so hopeless. The bot's ignoring me. I'm going to be alone forever." It was like, that's not exactly what we were aiming for. And so what they had to do was they had to put up a wait list, right? So this is a good thing to think about when you're talking about experiments. Like, you don't necessarily want them to go big most of the time. You want to keep them kind of controlled, right? And so for something like this, like Wizard of Oz, they were able to do a wait list, and then, they were able to respond to the people making the requests. But obviously, like, it wasn't ideal early on because it just completely overwhelmed the team. And this has happened in many cases. Like in the book, I write about Realtor.com, and they, they were doing a concierge experiment, and they toggled it on and then went out to lunch and came back, and there was 100 signups, and it took 15 minutes to do every delivery. And then you do 100 times 15, and you realize, oh wow, I created a lot of work for myself, But the thing here is, we come back to these 3 circles I mentioned earlier, right? Desirable, viable, and feasible. So desirability, I would give that a big check mark, because they had like overwhelming demand. Like, men would just ask a bot for dating advice. like they're just clueless. For feasibility, it was kind of a question mark, because you have to take all the requests and then start using that to inform the bot. And you could do that. It just takes time. And it was not an obviously like we could do it right away. It was kind of like a question mark whether or not that could happen adequately enough. And viability was a giant like fail. Basically, no one wanted to pay for it. You would like to think you'd get better at dating over time. I don't know. And you wouldn't need a subscription to a bot. Maybe times have changed. I don't know. Maybe the pandemic changed things. Maybe this would be like a unicorn now. But at the time, the team was like, you know what? We can't. There's no way. There's no way we can do this. So they ended up killing it. But I think what they learned from it, right, informed other stuff. Like I said, one of them team members has her own startup now that's doing something like this, but for parents, with young kids. And overall, I like that they didn't just jump to building the bot right away. So what I wanted to do, let me lock this stuff down. So what I wanted to do was, I want you to play with this a little bit. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes. For those of you that aren't in here, just click this guy right here. There you go. So it just opens a tab, and it's just like a virtual, like using Keynote or something. It's pretty easy to use. But basically, to create a sticky, all you do is like you double click, and then it types right away. So nothing advanced here, just like creating stickies. You don't have to draw or anything like I was doing. But what I want you to do is I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and I want you to come over here and look at these experiments, right? And see like what you're working on right now. Is there a list of experiments here that you think might help you out? Like what are like 3 to 5 experiments that might help you generate the evidence you need to invest in it. All right. So I'm gonna set a timer here, play some music. So give you 10. We might go over for Q&A, just a heads up with the team here. And I want you to just use sticky notes. You can just put them right below where mine is as well. Okay. So 10 minutes and go. about 5 minutes left. Two minutes left. Right. Oh, little like seatbelt sound. I was flying yesterday though, so I guess it's starting to happen again. All right. So we have a bit time of Q&A. I can hang out a little bit over time limit too. I know because I had you all doing exercises and stuff, so we went over a bit. But any questions you all have for me, either on the sequence you created here? I see a lot of really cool sequences, or other questions that came through in chat. Happy to address, a few of these before we wrap up again today. And also you'll have this board for 30 days. So just keep the link, or the organizers here can make sure you have the link. I'll leave it up for a bit for you if you want to come back and reference stuff. So yeah, what
Great.
questions do you have for me?
Everyone, if you have a question, please raise your digital hand here in Zoom to see you and let you ask the question directly, or you can ask them in the chat and keep the chat rolling until we have any hands. I don't see anything yet. Okay, David, we're going to give you the questions that were asked in the chat. Dimitris and Dimitris, let's pick the first one.
Okay, so we have a very relevant to the example, David, that you gave us, which is how long was that process of men's dating advice chatbot? How long did that take, that experiment?
All those together, it was somewhere between 10 to 12 weeks. So I use 12 weeks as a nice little time box. I have to say, depending on the industry you're working in, if it's not software related, sometimes that has to be a little longer. Like if I'm working with manufacturing companies, sometimes they can't do a lot. Although I challenge them quite a bit because, there's a lot you can do from preference and prioritization, value prop testing that's not coupled to the manufacturing process. But yeah, I usually run for 12 weeks. I like it because I don't want teams to get too excited or too depressed after the first experiment. And so if you ran one and it was horrible, I don't want them to give up. And if they ran one, it was a great success, I don't want them to say, great, let's build the whole thing. So over the course of 12 weeks, running a sequence, even if you did an experiment a week, that should be enough evidence to start giving you directional evidence, whether you should pivot, persevere, or kill the thing. So I like it as a checkpoint. And I usually, if I'm working with big companies, we'll tie that in with leadership. So leadership is asking questions, because I usually prep them first on, hey, tell me about the experiments you ran. Where do you think your risk is now? What would you use the funding for if we gave you more funding for this? How would you run more experiments to de-risk it, So I do a lot of work behind the scenes with companies to tie it into like metered funding. But, it's not perfect, but I like 12 weeks just because, again, I don't want people getting too depressed or too excited right away. I want, making the case for whether we should do this or not over a series of weeks.
Nice.
I don't see any hands. So Dimitris, another question. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we have a question from the chat. So as researchers, designers, you pick the name, right? During product discovery, we look into whether the problem is there, if a substitute solution is there, if there a user need, etc. Right? So how do you recommend we approach product discovery if we observe that a need is there, but the user need we have identified is not yet in the user's mind?
Yeah, that happens quite a bit. And so one of the framing I like to apply to that is, again, from Steve Blank, and there's some other people who use this as well, but do they have the problem? Are they aware of the problem? Are they actively seeking a solution to the problem? And then you could always go up to like, have they built their own solution to the problem? And so when you think about early adopters, they should be at the higher points of that pyramid. You should be looking for people that already have the problem and are seeking a solution and either couldn't find one or built their own. And so if your solution doesn't resonate there, there's a good chance it's not going to resonate with the people who aren't even aware they have the problem yet, right? Because you have to build awareness there. And so if you think of like that bell curve of like technology adoption, cycle, I would tend to start with people that at least are aware and are seeking. And then once you tweak it, then you move on to people that maybe they're aware and they're not seeking, or people that have the problem and they're not aware, right? But I would just be really careful targeting people who have the problem and aren't aware right away. I would try to, if possible, try to find people that are at least aware and then fine tune it from there. But that's how I approach it. So it's usually early adopters that have aware, seeking is sort of the framing I use.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any direct questions? Let me see your hands. No. So Dimitris, another question from the chat.
Yeah, I have a question. How do teams react to the realization of missing evidence? Based on your experience, do teams mature towards searching for evidence as years pass and the industry matures, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I apply this more like to social sciences than anything else. I know we like to say this is a scientific method applied to business, applied to product. In reality, I feel it's closer to social sciences. And so we have a lot to build on there, right? So from an ethics perspective, right, we don't want to test with customer, we don't want to test on customers, we want to test with them, right? And so there's a lot of things I try to do there. And with the evidence perspective, you're really trying to go from light to strong. And so light evidence, interviews, surveys, right? You can't keep going back to interviews and surveys and increase the strength of evidence, right? Like you're just getting more of the light evidence. And granted, you'll learn some more insights, right? But you're not necessarily moving it closer to the real world, to will they interact and pay for the thing we're about to launch. And so what I'm trying to help teams with is like calibrate their confidence over time. So teams that can move beyond interviews and surveys, they're able to go to, oh, maybe do a paper prototype now, test. Okay, now clickable. Okay, let's test with that. Okay, maybe we back up and do an explainer video and show it to them. Okay, now we take the explainer view, put on a landing page. Okay, from there we have a call to action, and then we concierge deliver the value to them. Like they're getting closer to the real world over time. I would say an anti-pattern to look for is the teams that just keep doing interviews and surveys and then they build the whole thing. You're placing, like if you get it right, you look like you're a genius. But if you get it wrong, you're placing a really big bet, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, on something that's really, really light evidence that's anecdotal. And so what I'm trying to change the mindset of teams is that let's do other things to increase that level, like our confidence levels, and not be overconfident about really light evidence stuff. And so when I see teams mature over time, they do more than just interviews and surveys over and over again.
Yeah, it's risk management, so we have to be aware of the risk and then take decisions based on this. Do I have another question, a last question for today? David, if it is okay with you. The last question, okay, Dimitris?
A lot of people are, at least here in Greece, right, are facing an issue trying to test their ideas, their boss's idea. They want to do the research, but they don't have, let's say, the budget or the permission, or they're trying to do something, but they need to gather more evidence, right? So a question to you would be, how do you suggest people handle founders and C-level executives that believe that they're the reincarnation of Steve Jobs, right? And they know whatever needs to be done, and they have seen the future, and people just need to beat what they say.
Yeah, I get Steve Jobs quotes quite a bit. Even in the Valley, everyone thinks, well, now they think they're Elon. So Elon's a new Steve, apparently. So the thing what kills me here is that like even Steve Jobs talked to customers, like even Apple talks to customers. Now, Apple does not ask the customer to design the solution for them, right? They try to get to the pains behind what they're experiencing, right? Because there's this quote, right, of like, well, the customer doesn't know what they want until they see it, but they can talk about all the problems they're experiencing, right? So it's your job to design the solution. It's not the customer's job to design a solution for you. And so I think it gets twisted a bit. It gets twisted into like, well, just don't talk to customers. That's what Steve Jobs said. I'm like, I don't think that's exactly what he meant, but he's not around really to explain himself now. So unfortunately, what I try to do is I try to get people to talk about what they're worried about. So remember these themes, I kind of kicked us off with these themes: desirable, viable, and feasible. If you get founders and C-suite to start talking about what they're worried about, there's a good chance it falls into one of these three buckets. They're worried about low customer adoption. They're worried about them paying enough. They're worried about their ability to build the thing, right? So if you can get them talking about what they're worried about, then I tend to back into one of these themes. And I'm like, oh, okay, so you're really worried about X. Well, what can we do to go like check? What can we do to go check to just make sure we're on the right track? And so I don't lead with all the tools. I don't lead with all the experiments. I don't lead with, let's develop a framework for systematically identifying and extracting and mapping your hypotheses and designing experiments and pivot, persevere, kill based on the evidence. I don't do that anymore. They will shut you down. They will just not pay attention to the words coming out of your mouth. So what you can do instead is you can use voice of the customer. You can talk to them in ways they understand. What are you worried about? How do we de-risk that? How do we make good investment decisions? These are usually things founders and C-suite care about, right? So if you can get them talking about that stuff, then you can back your way into some of this. But without that, you know, if you lead with the tools, you lead with the processes, there's a good chance they think you're more excited about that than helping them. And even though that's not your intent, they'll shut you down. So what I've learned, and I've learned a lot of this working with Alex over the years, is let's talk in languages they get. Let's get them talking about stuff they're worried about. And let's back our way into, well, let's not just build it and see what happens. Like, how do we test that before? Like, if we're worried about this stuff. If they're not worried about anything, then I'm not sure what to say. Not everyone comes along for the ride in this journey. If they're very egocentric leader, they have all the answers, they're never wrong, there's a good chance they're not going to be opening up to this. I find that's rarely the case, though. There's usually people out there, the majority, who are worried about something. If you just get them talking about it, then you can back your way into this process. So don't lead with all the tools, would be my advice.
Yeah, there is
So
no such thing
what do you
like
do?
no worries. It's no worries yet. So we have to understand, identify, and define what worries us. Yeah, Dimitris, go on.
What do you do if they're worried about time to market? This is all they're focusing right now. Because I know I'm the genius, I know what we need to build, and you need to build it fast because we need to be first.
Then it's, how do you test your go-to-market strategy? Like, how do you test out your channels? How do you test out, like, you're going to hit the right market? Like, you could still say, we're going to do cheap and fast experiments to inform that strategy, right? Versus just build it out and execute. So I just take this, what are they worried about? If they're trying to go to market fast, okay, what could get in the way of doing that? Like, what's the cost of us going to the wrong market quickly? Can we recover from that? You know, so again, I think opening them up to what they're worried about, maybe it's a cultural thing, but I think that tends to be a good angle for me anyway.
David, you have the authority, but for everyone else, how about that being the party pooper when asking the stakeholder, what worries you? How can we, John asks, how do we know we are not wrong? So how about overcoming this party pooper, attitude when talking to stakeholders? Your experience, your thoughts, your tips on that.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're choosing to use as, you know, where to apply this stuff. So where I tend to focus is either try not to do it on everything right away. Try to pick something where your company just constantly failed at it. Like, try to pick something where, you know, you just didn't understand the problem well enough and you jumped to solutions. And I look for these small wins where I can socialize that we were able to solve something. And then they're like, oh, how'd you solve that? And it's like, oh, we just solved it working a different way. So I tried to be very specific about the types of ideas, especially if we're new to working this way, the types of ideas I'm choosing to try and get in and use this methodology on. I don't try to use it everywhere, right? So I think just being really thoughtful about that. And so if you're trying to use it on a 30-year-old product that has predictable ROI and you're going to get a bunch of pushback and there's a whole fiefdom built around the thing, maybe pick and choose your battles. Maybe choose it on the one where you launched something and it flopped, or you've tried to solve the problem many different ways over time with the company and none of them worked and the customers didn't like any of them, right? You just can't keep doing the same thing over and over again, right? So you could say, hey, well, what if we take a step back and maybe we just like need to understand the problem a bit more because none of our solutions landed, and what would we do to do that? Like, so I would just be really mindful of where you pick and choose your battles, especially, you know, I'm on the outside coming in, right? So I'm a visitor, but you all are like in the system, you're in the org, right? And so it's a little different for you. Sometimes I'm coming in from the outside and just reinforcing your messages. So sometimes that helps, but I would say just pick and choose your battles and try not to just keep going up against a wall. Like, try to find some place where we think we've never solved for this. Maybe this way of working will help us solve for it.
Awesome. David, thanks again for being here today, for your talk and for the discussions we had. How great is to hear the words business and ideas and testing in the same sentence. It's a common sense that's not common. So we have to talk constantly about those things. Everyone, if you have any more questions or any questions that we don't have the time to discuss, please ask them on LinkedIn to continue the discussion threads there. Let me share my screen again. Here's my screen. And speaking of that, you can both ask your questions and win some of our books. You can post them on LinkedIn using the hashtags UX and UX Greece for about
David's book.
Okay, spoiler alert. Yeah, David's
book.
And this is the book, Testing Business Ideas, a great book from the Strategizer series, a great series of books. Also, David, a few words about this online course.
Yeah, so this is something new I've been doing, and I wanted to share it with all you. Again, I don't really pitch much during these sessions, but yeah, this is something I just want to mention to all of you, that I've been asked a lot to take individuals through this framework, and most of my work's with teams. You know, I'm usually working with like billion-dollar corporations, helping the teams create new ideas. And so I felt like I was missing out on this really cool segment of just being able to hang out with people and help them test stuff and learn it over time and put it into action on like real ideas they had. So I've kind of found this like happy little compromise where I take a small group of people through this content over 10 days. And I go through step by step, like how to extract your assumptions, how to map them, how to design experiments, how to test them out, but you're using your real ideas. And then you can share out with each other. So it's been fun. It's been new for me. The first one I ran in July was a huge success. And so now I'm running another one in October. And so, yeah, I just want to let you know that's up. So obviously no pressure. If you think it's cool, then sign up. But yeah, this is something I'm doing new that I'm loving it because I can live coach people through it. So it's a lot of fun.
Great. Again, a special thanks to our sponsors, Zanshin Labs, the UX Prodigy, and the From Scratch Design Studio. Don't forget to follow the UX Greece page on LinkedIn, and also the UX Thessaloniki and Athens UX communities on meetup.com, and stay tuned for the upcoming events this season. And I think that's all for today. Thanks everyone for being here. See you again very, very soon. Stay tuned.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David.
Bye-bye.